All right. Oh man, what a great day so far. I trust that the breakouts were helpful and inspiring to you. In the first session this morning, we did sort of a big picture, high level, 30,000 foot view sort of flyover. A little bit of the digital age, our ecclesiology in the digital age, but I did hint very strongly. Not even hint. At some points emphatically addressed formation and discipleship in the digital age. So in this session, what I would like to do is unpack that a little bit further. If the first session was about the analog church, this session is really about the analog Christian. And there is so much to say about this. I think, should I press next on that? There we go, analog Christian. If the first session was at the intersection of our ecclesiology in the digital age, then I want to do a little bit deeper dive for the next few moments with you on the intersection between our discipleship and our formation into Christ-likeness in the digital age. To begin, let me share this really interesting statistic. In the 1940s, upwards of 40% of American adults smoked cigarettes, at least casually. It was over 40% actually, and in certain years, that percentage hovered near the 50% mark. Some of you are familiar with the television show Mad Men that had like a long run. It's not on anymore, but if you ever watched an episode of Mad Men, I think I saw a study once where they studied each episode and had an average number of cigarettes smoked per episode, and it was like dozens. Because that show takes place in the 50s and 60s, and that was just what people did. Now, throughout the 40s, as that number in terms of people who smoked cigarettes hovered in the 40% percentile, that number would go up and down year by year. And there was a couple of years where the number started dipping pretty low and getting really close to 40%. And so there was real panic amongst tobacco companies. In Camel cigarettes in particular, they wanted to do something about this. So they hired an advertising firm called the William Esty Ad Agency. And William Esty Ad Agency worked with Camel cigarettes, and they developed an ad campaign called More Doctors. And I'll show you here a couple of the advertisements. This ad campaign, essentially, one of the reasons why the percentages started dipping was because as early as the 1940s, there were some rumors that smoking cigarettes might actually be bad for your health. And so Camel Cigarettes hires this ad agency, and this ad agency comes up with this brilliant proposal to get doctors to essentially be in ads to say Camel cigarettes are the healthiest cigarettes you could possibly smoke. In fact, they're fresh. Smoke a fresh cigarette. In fact, more doctors, you guys, the people who know the most there is possibly to know about our health, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Now, here's what's really interesting. In actuality, these ads were fake. They were false. They would spew all of these statistics that, like, for example, one example, Camel cigarettes claimed at one point that like 80% of doctors in America preferred Camel cigarettes. Well, the reality is the way they came up with that data is William Esty Ad Agency went to medical conferences with free cartons of Camel cigarettes. They would go to doctors and medical practitioners and say, hey, what is your favorite brand of cigarette? Whether they smoked or not, they would say, what is your favorite brand of cigarette, while handing them a free carton of Camel cigarettes. And the doctors would typically, about 80% of them would say, Camel cigarettes, I guess. And so they use that in their ad campaign. Now, I show you these advertisements because whether you smoke or not, my guess is that most of you don't. If hopefully none of you, it's bad for you. If right now you're like, what's wrong with that? It's like, it's bad for your health. Now, when we see these advertisements today, less than 100 years later, it's laughable. right? It's laughable because the overwhelming majority of people and the overwhelming majority of the medical community emphatically tell you smoking cigarettes is really bad for your health, right? This is laughable to us. But I do wonder if 50 years from now, we will look back on how addicted and tethered we are to our digital devices and laugh in the same way. But it won't be laughter that's like funny. It'll be like laughter through tears and pain because of the consequences. I wonder that. We're starting to see some of this already. And if you don't believe that digital addiction is a real thing, let me just tell you it is. Today, the average smartphone user spends 3 hours a day on their phone. 3 hours a day. The average smartphone user, this data actually came directly from Apple. The average iPhone, specifically the average iPhone user, unlocks their phone 150 times a day. Now, you might be sitting there thinking like, wow, those people are crazy. That's not me. Tomorrow, keep track of how often you unlock your phone, and you will be shocked. 150 times a day. 84% of smartphone users admit that they could not go one full day without their phone. 84%. 50% of teenagers admit, these are just those who admit it, 50% of teenagers admit that they are fully addicted to their phones. 87% of smartphone owners open their phone and then look at their phone within 1 hour of waking and sleeping. Meaning almost 90% of smartphone users, one of the first things they do and one of the last things they do is look at their phone. If you average out, now social media is in its early stages still, but if you average out over a lifespan, you just do the math and average out over a lifespan, multiply how much time social media users spend on social media right now and average it out over an average lifespan, the average social media user will spend 5 entire years of their life on social media. 5 years. Again, I mentioned this in the last session, there is overwhelming data that tells us the internet's promise of creating a connected, meaningful global village has proven itself to be a farce, a lie. That we are more disconnected than ever before. And in reality, that disconnection has undone some things in us in really dangerous ways. I mean, the dangerous mental, emotional, physical effects of our digital addictions are well documented at this point. There are incredible thinkers and writers out there, not Christian, just people, social commentators. If you're interested, I would recommend to you people like Jaron Lanier, Tristan Harris, Adam Alter, Nicholas Carr, Sherry Turkle. If you want to go back further, maybe someone like a Neil Postman or a Marshall McLuhan. There have been non-Christian thinkers who have written extensively about how technologies in general and digital technologies very specifically are actually damaging us. And so as church leaders, as pastors, as men and women who care deeply about the church and about the congregations that we are called to, that we are a part of, that we serve, and as such, as we care deeply and work toward helping as many people as possible become more Christ-like in their lives, to become formed into Christ-likeness, to journey along the path of discipleship, we have to address and reckon with and respond well to the digital undoing in our midst. And there is a lot that is being undone. Here are a few things. In my opinion, I believe that our digital addictions are leading to what I would call self-centric despair, a sort of inward gaze that we cannot snap out of as we compare the lowlights of our real lives against the glossy highlights of everyone else's social media lives. And even though intellectually we know that other people's social media feeds are just their glossed up highlights, we have a hard time embodying that belief. And we compare our lives to their social media highlights, and we start to look inward and just despair. Why doesn't my life look, sound, and feel like that? Or if I want to really experience meaning and purpose and joy in my life has to look like that. I would also say in the digital age, our digital addictions are ruining us with comparison. This is connected to self-centric despair. We are lulled in to the social media feeds, driven in large part by this uncontrollable beast inside of us called comparison. We just find ourselves comparing, our lives to the glossy digital feeds of those we think we know. This often leads to contempt. Just scroll Twitter for 5 minutes and you will find contempt. We are becoming an increasingly contemptuous people toward one another. Remember what we talked about in the first session, that we are losing our patience. We're becoming incredibly impatient. And in losing our patience and in losing our depth and becoming shallow, we are also losing our aptitude for nuance. This is why Twitter becomes just the Wild West, right? Where words are bullets and send buttons are triggers. It's the Wild West. We're just pulling out our gun and shooting each other. So much contempt. Again, we've already talked about impatience. We're growing deeply impatient. We're growing hostile toward one another. We're growing forgetful. And I don't just mean that our memories are being damaged, although there is strong evidence that that is the case with increased digital use and in particular social media use, that it is affecting our actual literal memory. But I mean we are forgetting what is real because we spend so much time in that which is digital. Outrage, I'm sure you can relate to this. We live in an outrage culture. If this is connected to what we talked about in the first main session about individualism. Everybody is outraged because when something out there in the digital landscape isn't quite curated to my own preferences, outrage is the response. And then reckless indulgence. The internet has given us accessibility and opportunity to recklessly indulge in a wide variety of ways. Now, I could talk for hours about each of these, but what I actually want to do is ask the question, if these are some of the dangerous sort of byproducts or consequences of our digital addictions, then what is the solution? I would turn our attention to the words of Paul, the famous words of Paul in Galatians chapter 5. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. I would suggest to you that when we biblically unpack each of these virtues of the singular fruit of the Spirit, that each of these virtues, each of these characteristics of the fruit of the Spirit of God bearing fruit in our lives and the lives of the people we are called to serve and to lead, each of these characteristics, each of these virtues stands as a dynamic and transformative antidote to all that ails us in the digital age. Love instead of self-centric despair. Joy instead of comparison. Peace instead of contempt, patience instead of impatience, kindness and goodness instead of hostility, faithfulness instead of forgetfulness, gentleness instead of outrage, self-control instead of reckless indulgence. How does this work? How do we embody and live day by day, inviting the Spirit of God to bear this fruit in us, slow and steady over time? But Paul tells us later in Galatians 5, just a couple of verses down. He says, if we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit. If we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit. That phrase, keep in step, in the ESV, is actually, in the original language of the text, it's actually a single Greek word. It's a single Greek word that's actually a Roman military term. It's a word that would describe this. When the Roman military would gather in battle formation, they would gather something like this. They would create like a large phalanx, or they had all sorts of different sort of designs, several, but they would essentially they would mobilize in such a way that they would create almost an impenetrable sort of shield with their weapons out as they went into battle. This is one of the things that made the Roman Empire the greatest military force on the face of the planet at the time. That phrase, keep in step, is a single Greek word that is a military term that describes this. So what Paul is saying is, if you want to experience the fruit of the Spirit in your life, you have to live like this. Meaning, if one of these individuals falls out of line, the entire thing comes apart. Every step they took along these lines, every step they took was in unison and connected to the other. That's what it means. So if we want to experience the fruit of the Spirit in our lives, we have to align ourselves with the Spirit of God and walk through life step by step in union with God. But this is easier said than done. We know that from experience. So how does this work? Again, particularly as we think about the consequences, all that which ails us from our digital addictions, and we consider these virtues, these characteristics of the fruit of the Spirit, and we want to embody those characteristics, live out those virtues. How do we do it? Well, we do it by keeping in step with the Spirit, by being almost militant about how we walk through life. Now, each of those characteristics, each of those virtues takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort to walk in the way of, let's say, as an example, joy. So we'll just take joy as an example. How does this work? Right? How do we keep in step with the Spirit of God? If joy is, sorry, I'm like really messing up my slides here. If joy is one of the characteristics of the fruit of the Spirit, and if joy is that which can act as an antidote to the digital consequence of comparison, how does that work? What does that actually mean? What does it entail? And so again, we could talk endlessly about each of those virtues, each of those characteristics, but let's just spend a few moments talking about one, just as an example, joy. Joy instead of comparison in the digital age, as a way of forming our lives and helping our people form their lives into more and more Christ-likeness. How do we embody, by the Spirit of God, joy in our lives to erase or undo the entangled mess we find ourselves in because of comparison? How do we do this? Several years ago, I told you earlier that my daughter is almost 7 and our son is 3. But my wife and I have been married for 13 years. So if you do the math, we didn't have children for the first 6 years of our marriage. And that was not by choice. We actually wanted to start a family pretty early, but when we began trying to start a family, we were faced with a very dark, foreboding cloud of infertility. And I know that some of us in this room have experienced the pain of that. And it is a dark cloud that just hovers over you and seems like it never goes away. And for half a decade, for about 5 years, my wife and I lived with this cloud hovering over us. And as I think about that, I can recall back, we had several friends who are our age who we share like similar life stages. They got married around the same time we got married, and they started trying to have families or have children when we started trying to have children. But we were faced with infertility, so we were unable to have children for several years. But some of our friends were able to have children. Infertility was not an issue for them. And I can recall back going through my Facebook feed and my Instagram feed at the time and watching these friends one by one over the course of a couple of years have all of these pregnancy announcements on their social media feed. Remember, the low light of my real life compared to the backdrop of the glossy sort of highlights of their social media feeds. And what I found myself doing was really, really sad. I found myself comparing my life to their social media feed. And these are people I love. These are people I care deeply about. And yet still, I found myself comparing, and even though these are men and women that I love deeply and care deeply about, I found myself moving from comparison to contempt. I started holding real contempt inside toward these people that I loved and cared about. And that contempt led to self-centric despair. I just started feeling like, oh my goodness, all I could think about day and night was why things weren't happening the way I thought they would happen in my life. I had blinders on, and all I was consumed with was what I lacked in my life, self-centric despair. And this led to a loss of joy. These all interplay with one another. Comparison led to contempt. Contempt led to self-centric despair, and self-centric despair led to a loss of joy. And because for Jenny and I, it felt like our joy was gone, she and I started searching for supplements and substitutes, right? Because we couldn't control infertility, we thought that we could gain some semblance of joy back through things that we could control, like leisure and food and curated excursions and vacations. I thought if we could just do those things that we can control, that which we were robbed of because of infertility, I thought we could find it by doing things we could control, by essentially curating a life that looked more like the glossy feeds of people's social media. And the reason I thought that was because I made the mistake of believing that pleasure was joy. Because I lacked genuine joy and I wanted it so bad, I tried to create pleasure in my life because I, for some reason, believed pleasure is joy. The British psychologist Michael Eysenck, he said this, he coined this phrase in the late 90s, the hedonic treadmill. Hedonic is the adjective of the word hedonism, which is the unremitting pursuit of pleasure, that which feels good. And Eysenck essentially said that in the modern West, we have become addicted to pleasure. We are functional hedonists. That's what culture sells us, and that is what we are buying. And another way to think about this is we chase sparks of pleasure. Some of you know Marie Kondo. Any Marie Kondo fans in here? Okay, well, there we go. A couple of Marie Kondo fans. I'm sure Marie Kondo is great. My wife would tell you she's wonderful, and she has changed how we fold our laundry in our house. So thank you, Marie Kondo, for that. But if you go on Marie Kondo's website, her entire thing is based on what sparks joy. That's the question you are supposed to ask. Now, what's really interesting is that word, spark. So essentially, in the Kondo method of things, as you tidy up your home and pursue some minimalism or simplicity, you are supposed to look at that old piece of Tupperware or that old t-shirt with holes in it and ask yourself the question, does this Tupperware spark joy? And if it doesn't, discard. Does this t-shirt spark joy? And if it doesn't, discard. Now, this is all well and good when it comes to Tupperware and t-shirts, but it becomes incredibly destructive when it comes to the more meaningful things in life, and yet we have applied the principle to everything. This is why when marriages end, what do you often hear? The spark is gone. So, marriage, does it spark joy? No. Discard. I used to love this church community, but now not so much. Does it spark joy? Discard. Dr. Plummer and I were privileged to be a part of a collection of writings through the Gospel Coalition about deconstruction. And the whole deconstruction movement, this is oversimplifying, but a large part of it is the application of this same question. This faith of my childhood, does it still spark joy? No. Discard. Deconstruct. Now, that's oversimplifying, right? I don't mean to offend those who are going through a deconstruction process. There's a healthy way to deconstruct for sure. But for many, that's what it comes down to. If the spark is gone, then we throw it away. And this works if your life is truly centered around the pursuit of pleasure. But pleasure is not the antidote to the destructive nature of comparison in our lives. And pleasure is not an attribute of the fruit of the Spirit. Joy is. Not pleasure. Not good feelings. Not happy butterflies in your stomach. But joy. So the question, if joy isn't pleasure, what is joy? What is joy? In the Old Testament, there are multiple Hebrew words for the English word joy. One of the most common is the Hebrew word simha. It's found almost 100 times throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, what we often call the Old Testament. And the word simha is a word that actually describes a person or a people's state of being when in fellowship with or in connection to God. In other words, the word simha, as it is used in the Scriptures, it is most often connected to one's proximity to God. So joy, in other words, biblically speaking, joy, its location is not elusive. It's clear. This is interesting because we find ourselves chasing joy, don't we? The problem is, you're chasing the wrong thing. Biblically speaking, joy is found in close proximity to God. So what that means is, even just mathematically, if you want joy, you can find it. It's available. Its location is not a mystery. It is in close proximity to God. Let me just show you a couple of examples from the Psalms. Psalm 16, in your presence there is fullness of joy. Psalm 21, you make me glad with the joy, simha, of your presence. There is verse after verse, passage after passage, just like this. Now, not just that, but the word simha also describes God's posture toward his people and creation itself. Psalm 104, may the Lord rejoice, simha, in his works. Zephaniah 3, the Lord your God is in your midst, a warrior who gives you victory. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will renew you in his love. He will exult over you with loud singing. God sings over us. And it is in our midst, when God is in our midst, or better put, when we are in the presence of God, there is joy. There is joy from God to us, and there is joy that we experience, fullness of joy, in fact, in the presence of God. So the location of joy is not elusive, it is not a mystery, it's very clear. The problem is, most people run on a hedonic treadmill. It is a treadmill because you exhaust yourself running, but you get nowhere. You are always chasing, you never arrive on a treadmill. We do this because we are chasing pleasure. When joy is offered to us and its location is clear, it is in close proximity to God, in the presence of God. Now, when we go to the New Testament, joy in the New Testament, the most common word for joy in the New Testament is the Greek word hara. It's found 59 times. And again, it is an attribute of the fruit of the Spirit. We read this already. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, on and on. It is that which God gives. This falls in line with the Hebrew word simha. the fruit of God's Spirit moving and working in our lives, one of the attributes is joy. And of course it is, because when the Spirit of God is moving in and through us, we are in close proximity to God, or God is in close proximity to us. So of course the natural byproduct would be joy. And this word hurrah, joy, it's a word that is not contingent upon circumstances. This is where the difference between pleasure and joy really reveals itself. It is not contingent upon circumstances, but rather, joy, hurrah, is a steadiness within, built on the goodness of God, and it prevails even in the midst of suffering. This is why Paul writes in Colossians 1, "Now I rejoice in what I am suffering for you." This verse makes no sense if joy is pleasure. No one would say, "I have pleasure in what I am suffering for you." That actually literally doesn't make sense unless you're like off your rocker, right? The psychological issues. This is also why in Hebrews 12, we read that Jesus, we fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. Again, if the verse said, for the pleasure, for the good feelings, for the comfort set before him, he endured the cross, the sentence would make no sense. But what we see and recognize here is that joy is something else. It's actually not contingent upon circumstances. It's not contingent upon whether things are or are not going our way. Dallas Willard, again, he says this, that joy is not a passing sensation of pleasure, but a pervasive sense of well-being that is infused with hope because of the goodness of God. I mean, we could speak for an hour about just this quote. Joy is not just a fleeting, passing sensation, i.e., a spark of pleasure. That is not joy. It is a pervasive sense of well-being that is also infused with hope. In other words, it recognizes that things are not always going to be as they someday will be when God renews all things and makes all wrongs right. So there is hope because not of circumstances, not our own abilities, not our ingenuity or our skill or our resources, but because of the goodness of God. And this means that God welcomes us into his joy, not after we get over our sorrow and pain and grief, but he welcomes us into his joy with all of our sorrow and pain and our grief. Eugene Peterson puts it this way, that joy is not a requirement for Christian discipleship, it is a consequence. It is not what we have to acquire in order to experience life in Christ. It is what comes to us when we are walking in the way of faith and obedience. Joy, you don't have to feel joyful to follow Jesus. But follow Jesus, live in close proximity to the God of the universe, and joy will be an inevitable consequence in the midst of the sorrow and the pain. This is why Jesus says in John 16, ask and you will receive, and your joy will be made complete. This is why Paul writes, just one example, he says this kind of thing all the time. May the God of hope fill you with all joy. This is why in the book of James, the writer says, count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you meet trials of various kinds. Again, if joy is a spark of pleasure, this makes no sense. Count it all pleasure, count it all good feelings, count it all comfort when you meet trials of various kinds. What? No. Count it all joy. That phrase, count it all joy, in the yellow there, that entire phrase, again, is a single Greek word. And it's that word, the Greek word, is actually a mathematical term. So a way to understand it, the writer of James, this is from my friend John Mark Comer, he puts it this way. James is essentially saying, do the math. When you experience trials of various kinds, do the math, and it will lead you to joy. Okay, so what does that mean? What is the math? We turn again to Peterson. He's helpful here. Peterson says, just as joy builds on the past, it borrows from the future. This stands in stark contrast to the pursuit of pleasure driven by the depth of comparison that we find in the digital age. In the digital age, as we just scroll through our feeds and compare our present lives to the glossy social media feeds of others, we are urgent to try to make our real lives match the glossy highlights of others. If that's not you, that is most people in your church. I can guarantee you that. Now, here's the thing. That's the wrong math. What Peterson says here maps out for us what I believe, in part, James is saying. Do the math. What is that math? We'll start in the middle here. When we fixate on the present, with all of its uncertainties and anxieties and worries, the most common way to alleviate it is to try to medicate our uncertainties, anxieties, and worries with pleasure. Because anxieties, uncertainties, and worries feel so bad, we seek pleasure, which almost always initially feels so good. But pleasure is a spark, and sparks never last. And so, when the spark is gone, we find ourselves faced with the reality again of our uncertainties, anxieties, and worries, and we run the treadmill and continue seeking new sparks of pleasure. But here's how the math of biblical joy works. It hinges on the future and the past, and it affects the present. When we remember all that God has done in the past, in our lives and throughout history, when we remember that God has led the church through pandemics before, when we remember that God has led the church through wars before, when we remember that God has led the church through dramatic declines in church attendance before, when we remember that God has been faithful for 2,000 years of Christian church history and thousands of years to his people before that, when we remember that we have a God who parts seas so people can cross on dry land to rescue and renewal, when we remember that that same God who is in the business of rescuing us through the impossible, we have joy in the present no matter what seems impossible before us. And when we consider the future, when we consider all that God will do in our lives and in the world, when we remember the vision of the final book of the Bible, Revelation, later in that letter, when we see the vision of a new heavens and a new earth, a time and a place where God rules and reigns, and that is a time and a place where there are, as the writer tells us, no more tears, no more pain, no more mourning, no more death itself. When we remember that that's where the story is headed, that that is the story God is writing, and that in Jesus' death and resurrection, the final period at the end of the sentence has already been written, then no matter what we face in the present, we can have joy. Because we know how the story ends. This is how we do the math. This is why Tim Keller puts it this way, that while other worldviews lead us to sit in the midst of life's joys, foreseeing the coming sorrows, Christianity empowers its people to sit in the midst of this world's sorrows, tasting the coming joy. You and I have an opportunity, and we're just talking about joy here. There's like 8 other attributes to the fruit of the Spirit. When we think about the sort of endless loop of comparison that we often find ourselves in, and we often find our people, the people we are trying to serve and to lead and shepherd and guide, the loops that they find themselves in, we have incredible opportunity to help them see that joy is not pleasure, and that they don't need to keep running on that treadmill. And that no matter what they face today, God has been faithful, and He will be faithful, and He is faithful now. And when we embrace that truth, no matter what the digital age and no matter what social media tries to sell us, we can navigate our way through the comparison game and find real joy. Doing this work, seeking, finding, and embodying biblical joy, along with all the other attributes of the Spirit's fruit in our lives, it isn't easy. It isn't quick. As with all things in the digital age, it will stand in stark contrast to the speed and the pace at which we are accustomed to moving. It's more gardening than it is coding. You know what I mean? You have to get your fingers in the dirt. Another way to put it is it's like origami. Let me show you what I mean. One of the world's best origami artists alive today is a Japanese origami artist named Satoshi Kamiya. And his most famous piece is a dragon called the Ryujin 3.5. That's paper, you guys. Now, here's what's really crazy. In traditional origami, there are no cuts or alterations to the paper. And Satoshi Kamiya is a traditional origami artist. What that means is this piece, this dragon, is a single, uncut, unadulterated, large, square piece of paper. No cuts, no alterations. A scissor, a razor blade, whatever, nothing has touched this paper. Just his hands, folding one by one by one. Origami artists will often post online what's called their crease pattern. A crease pattern is actually it's an image that shows every single fold you have to make to create a particular origami piece. This is the crease pattern for Ryujin 3.5. Every line you see is an intricate fold of paper. Every single line. You can go on YouTube and look up tutorial videos on how to create the Ryujin 3.5. And the tutorial videos are sometimes 12 hours long. The world's most skilled origami artists, working 8 to 10 hours a day, will take 2 to 3, sometimes 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes a month. These are the world's most skilled origami artists. But here's what I know. This is what's really crazy. You could create the Ryujin 3.5. Every single one of you in this room could do this. And you're all shaking your head like, no way. Yeah, you could. But you won't. You know why you won't? Not because you don't know how. I just showed you how. No, I mean, really, I just showed you how. You can Google that and just print it out. You could literally print that sheet out on a large square piece of paper. You don't have to draw it. Like, you could just print that out. And there's 150 of us in here. We could create 150 Ryujin 3.5s. We could do it, but we won't. Right? We won't. Why won't we? Why won't we? It's hard. I don't have the time. There's no way. I'm not patient enough. My fingers are too fat, or whatever, right? There is excuse after excuse after excuse. Listen, there is no excuse. If you feel like your fingers are too fat, you can get a giant piece of paper where the folds are easier and create like a giant Ryujin 3.5. You could do it, but you won't. Because you don't have the time. It's not important enough to you. And so it is with cultivating the fruit of the Spirit in our lives. You and every man, woman, and child you serve could live with utter biblical joy. But most of them won't. Because they're too busy chasing pleasure when the joy of the universe is offered to them. I think of that C.S. Lewis quote, that we are like children making mud pies in the slum without any sense that we've been invited to a holiday out at sea. all of us can do it. All of us can detach ourselves from the tethering we experience in the digital age to the comparison game and self-centric despair and contempt and hostility and outrage and forgetfulness and reckless indulgence and on and on. We could do it. The question is, will we? Will we take the time, go slow and steady, and will we invite the people and communities and congregations we serve to take the time to go slow and steady, to fold their lives into the Spirit of God one fold at a time? That's the calling. And it will take a long time. I know we come to conferences like this, and you paid a little bit of money, so the hope was, this guy better give me the 3-step solution. There is no 3-step solution, because it's the fruit of the Spirit, not the microwavable dinner of the Spirit. You have to get your hands in the dirt and the soil, and you have to water and prune and give it sunlight and water again and more sun and more pruning. And slowly over time, you begin to see leaves above the ground. That's what we want. That's what you want for your people and for yourself. I know that. And so the question is, will you do that work? In a digital age when everything is microwavable, will you garden? Let's pray together. God, we thank you for your incredible grace in our lives that slowly and steadily over time forms us into the people you've called us to be. We ask that you would help us to be the sorts of leaders, pastors, who join you in that slow and steady work, patiently enfolding our own lives to keeping in step with your Spirit and inviting the congregations and communities we serve to do the same. And as we do, we pray that by your Spirit, you might change and transform us and make us new. We love you and we thank you. Pray these things, Jesus, in your name. Amen.